almost about that time. Right about now.
Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
What a fantastic book you've written. I'm so excited to talk. It's been something I've been thinking about so much. And the fact that you kind of like put it all down in the page was fascinating to me. And it was just like so much to mine there. So I'm excited to talk to you about that. Before we get to your book and all your findings, I want to hear a little bit about your origin story. I love, when I have writers on the show, I love to find out kind of like how they got to where they are in their career. So we were talking before we started rolling.
Are you talking about how I got to write this book, or just me?
No, just like your writing career. So I know you grew up in London. So you grew up on the other side of the pond.
Yes, yep. So I grew up in London, and I lived in London until my mid-30s, and I actually had a completely different career before. I was a producer and director at the BBC in London, mainly working on documentaries.
Wow.
And TV production. Yeah. And so, and I did some, a little bit of reality TV and a little bit of current affairs, but mainly documentaries was my main thing. Cool. And then we had a baby, and, when he was 1, we moved to America. And I had in that year when I sort of had some maternity leave, and then I did do 3 months of trying to combine a TV career with a baby. And that was kind of terrible for everybody. And it wasn't working. And then happily, my husband got a job working for a tech company out here in the States in California. And so we moved here, and there wasn't, up in Northern California, there's not so much of a TV industry here. So in a way, I was just looking for something completely different. And I started writing and, publishing things in, Huffington Post and the New York Times. And then one of the articles that I wrote for the New York Times turned into my first book, which is called America.
Wow.
Yeah, which is called America the Anxious, which is about moving to the US as a British person and the kind of American obsession with finding happiness. So I wrote that book and then carried on publishing various things. And then that turned into BoyMom when I had my 3rd son.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the anxious thing.
Yeah.
Americans' obsession with finding happy. We're not going to talk about your first book that much, but I am obsessed with that topic. And I feel like, is that not true in Britain? The British people are not obsessed with finding happiness?
I mean, I think they probably are at some deeper level, but it expresses itself in a really different way. I think there's this, British people are quite cynical, they're quite skeptical. And so they're not as sort of open to somebody coming along and saying, I can teach you the path to happiness, and so there's not so much of a sort of embrace of the self, but it's starting to change. And I think that British people are becoming more open to that kind of thing, but there isn't quite such a sort of cultural imperative to go out and live this happy ever after in the UK in the same way.
Interesting. All right. So let's go to your newest topic.
Yes.
And that is what is going on with boys and men.
Yes.
And is this just an American society, or do you feel like this is kind of crosses over to many different cultures when you wrote this book?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, so I wrote and reported the book mainly in the United States, but then I did write a UK version of it. I have a different publisher in the UK. And I thought, I didn't know when I started writing the UK version, would this be like a universal thing? Would I have to re-report the whole thing? Would it be totally different issues? And what I found was way more similarities than differences. And so I think, there are some sort of slight cultural differences, but I think the sort of themes of masculinity, of loneliness, of the way that we raise boys, it really was almost kind of a like for like in terms of the UK and the US. And obviously there's many other different cultures where things show up in slightly different ways. But I think there are some kind of, if not universals, then things that are very common in many different cultures.
Well, let's set the stage here about what we're talking about in case people don't really understand that there is a crisis going on here. And I was looking up some statistics before I got on with you, and they were shocking. And you kind of make reference to these in the beginning of your book, but in terms of like the landscape right now, that, men are 4 times as likely to kill themselves as women.
Yeah.
They're 3 times as likely to be addicted to some sort of drug, 12 times as likely to be incarcerated. Yeah. And then the dropping out of school phenomenon is really interesting. The 4 million more women there are 4 million more female undergraduates than male graduates on U.S. campuses, and guys tend to drop out of school a lot more, even than back in my day.
Yeah, they enroll far less and they drop out far more. So,
and there also seems to be a sort of, I don't know if this is measurable, but a sort of loneliness epidemic happening among men too.
Yeah, and so that shows up in like both in terms of how materially isolated men and boys are becoming. So they're spending more time on screens than their female peers and less time socializing in person, and also just sort of the way they report it. So I think there's, a quarter of men under 30 feel they have no close friends at all. And in my research for the book, I was talking to lots and lots of boys and men, and even the ones who did have friends and did hang out with their friends still felt this kind of loneliness because they felt that they weren't able to form these very deep, emotionally vulnerable, kind of supportive relationships that maybe women find easier to access.
Yeah. And one thing I really like about your book, aside from you being just an interested observer in this phenomena, you have a personal interest in it too. And you've written the book sort of as a half memoir, half,
half
research
reporting.
book, half reporting. And to explain that, you are not just the mother of one boy, but 3 boys.
3 boys. Yes. I'm a mom of 3 boys. They're now 13, 10 and 6. But the book, so the memoir part, so it's a hybrid of memoir and reporting and research. But the memoir part starts when my 3rd son was born, which was right at the time when the Me Too movement was just exploding. And this whole conversation about toxic masculinity and sort of male harm and all of those things was kicking off. So that was in 2017. So it starts then when I'm about to give birth to a 3rd boy in the context of all this. And then it finishes when my 3rd son goes off to kindergarten at the age of 5. So it's this 5-year period, which was also like a pretty challenging time in our own parenting journey. We had 3 boys.
COVID.
It was COVID. It spanned the pandemic. And also just personally, our kids were pretty wild. We were dealing with some quite challenging behavior and all of those things. Yeah,
I mean, I have one boy. One boy, and we gave him drumsticks and a drum kit and said, like, go and beat the hell out of these drums, and that seemed to work. And then we have a girl. And then we have a 14-year-old girl who has, I think, is a completely different experience. So that is a very different that's a whole other book.
Yeah.
Right. But what was your view? You talk about sort of your having boys view of what it would be like, what boys are like, and then what who were you before you had these 3 boys? You were a feminist. And
I still am a feminist. So I'm still very much a feminist, and I'm writing it through that lens. But I think that I grew up with this like version of feminism, which said that gender is like all socialized, that the reason why boys and girls behave differently is because we raise them differently. And the reason why boys, are sometimes badly behaved or destructive is because we kind of give them this like boys will be boys narrative and kind of allow them to get away with this kind of behavior. And then I had my 3 boys and I kind of felt a bit like I'd walked into my own ideological trap in a way.
Yeah.
Because I was so maintaining this idea that, there's no differences between boys and girls. And then my own boys, and the only reason why they behave badly is because we allow them to. And then my own boys were so wild and there was so much chaos and so much fighting and physicality. I was completely blindsided by it. And, I sort of felt a bit like, oh God, if it's only like this because we make them like this, then this must all be my fault. And obviously I was sort of experiencing this in the shadow of this whole conversation about toxic masculinity in the post-Me Too era. So it's like, there's Weinstein, there's Trump, there's incels, there's school shooters. So it sort of took on this like real baggage. It wasn't just like boys, being rambunctious. It suddenly was like, oh God, if they want these Nerf guns, does that mean that they're going to become high school shooters? Or if they behave like this, are they going to be these like toxic, entitled predators or whatever in the future? So I think everything felt really loaded.
Yeah. But you discover things that really were different than what you believed and what a lot of us believe. Yeah. I mean, what do you think of that term toxic masculinity? Do you think it's a helpful term?
It's an interesting question. I think that term was really useful in its moment to describe something. I think it does a really good job of describing a phenomenon that, and it's like, there's a reason why that term gained so much popularity, why it just sort
Right.
of went viral or whatever that means, because it did describe. And I think sometimes, when we find a phrase that describes a phenomenon that we kind of know exists, but we don't really know how to name, I think that the phrase toxic masculinity worked really well in that moment to describe a certain type of male behavior, a certain type of entitlement, a certain type of men gone bad phenomenon that was like part of, it's like an extreme version of something that's sort of in the culture more generally. I think now it's not particularly helpful as a way to frame these conversations. I think it's alienating to this generation of boys who feel like, well, we haven't done anything wrong. We're just kids.
Mm-hmm.
Why
Yeah.
are you treating us like this? I think it can shut down conversations.
Yep.
That really important conversations when boys and men feel like they need to be heard and would like some empathy and understanding. And so I think it had its moment that was useful, but I think maybe it's starting to outlive its usefulness.
Yeah, I think at one point you write that it's really seen when people talk about toxic masculinity, they really see it as in a punitive way, like we need to punish, like boys are bad, not boys. I think you say boys are bad, but not that boys are sad. Like there's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there is this tendency, both sort of at an individual level and at a cultural level, that we see troubled boys and we label them as bad and not sad. So, and often they kind of rise to that because those are the sort of terms that we allow them to live their lives on. And because we don't engage with their emotions in the same way, it sort of often becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So things like depression in boys often manifests more as like what they call externalizing behavior, so like substance abuse or aggression or acting out bad behavior, whereas depression in girls and women manifests more as like sadness. And I think that's because of the emotional range that we allow boys to access. And I think it is this thing, just going back to the thing about toxic masculinity, I think there is a way in which in this conversation that we've been having about toxic masculinity, we have labeled boys as harmful. And I think that's not a healthy way for any child to grow up. I think it's almost like we've sort of labeled them as these kind of predators in waiting. And the best we can hope for is to kind of minimize the damage that they're going to cause. We're not giving them this like positive narrative about, being an expansive and fulfilled human being. It's just like the best we can hope for is to just kind of limit the harm that you're going to cause.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. Well, what were some of the causes that you're finding for this, what's happening to boys right now? Let's talk a little bit about, you talk about nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit. I mean, as a mom, you know all about nurture. So like, what did your research reporting find about the way boys are being, well, let's talk about, the way boys are being raised now and like why is it not kind of working for a lot of them?
So I think that one of the things that really stood out to me, when I went into all this research about sex differences and, what's nature, what's nurture. And I think it's a very complicated area because obviously nature and nurture are super, super intertwined and genes get, epigenetics. So the genes get turned on and off. But one of the things that I found was that, we have this narrative that boys are these like roughy, tufty, aggressive, robust, but actually, there's a very strong body of literature that shows that baby boys are born more emotionally vulnerable than baby girls and more emotionally sensitive and fragile, which is kind of the opposite of the stereotype.
Yeah.
So like a baby boy is born with his brain about a month to 6 weeks behind a baby girl's brain in development. And that's mainly the right brain. So the right brain is the part it's responsible not so much for cognition or like whether you're good at reading maps or math or, those things that we tend to think of as gender differences. It's the part responsible for emotions, emotional self-regulation, and forming attachments. So because a baby boy's brain is immature at birth, and a baby girl's brain is more like resilient and independent, boys actually need more like nurturing support from caregivers in terms of, regulating their emotions, forming the attachment bond, all those sort of tasks that newborns have. and they're more vulnerable to disruption. So if something goes wrong, if they're like, there's neglect or poverty or postpartum depression or any kind of disruption, it's going to have a bigger effect on a baby boy than it does on a baby girl on average.
Oh, that's
These are all averages. And so you see this data down the line that all of these sort of adverse childhood circumstances tend to have a bigger impact at a population level on boys than they do on girls. And part of that is to do with this brain vulnerability. But what ends up happening is that because of the way, our ideas about masculinity and who boys are and what they need, although baby boys kind of need more of that kind of nurturing care, they tend to get less of it. So they tend to get less of that like really emotional engagement from their parents, like right from the beginning and all the way through. They get a lot more like roughhousing, and people tend to handle boys more roughly, and they project these kind of masculine qualities onto them, and they get less of that kind of deeper emotional nurture. And they're more likely to be physically punished than girls are, all of these different types of sort of hostile things that happen to boys too.
And also the way that pop culture and the media talk to boys, right, is different than what girls are getting. So like there's no nurturing, like you were talking, you were looking for books like nurturing kind of books for kids, for your boys, and there's like nothing.
There's nothing
like
there.
that.
Yeah. So like girls get all these stories about relationships and friendships and nurture, and boys get all these stories about basically adventures and battles. So it's like, all their stories are like, there's a hero, there's a villain, there's a winner and a loser. It's combative, it's competitive, and someone is a hero and someone dies, and that's the binary that they understand human interaction to mean. And I was just watching actually with my 6-year-old. We're going to go and see Inside Out 2 on
I saw it
the weekend.
I saw it last weekend.
So we were going to watch. So we watched Inside Out, the first movie, just to kind of prepare ourselves. So I'd seen it before, but before I'd sort of been doing all this research. And what was really interesting to me watching it with my son was that like, it's this story, and obviously, as you know, it's like a girl, and she has this very fully developed emotional life and this interiority. And every time a male character comes on the screen, his interiority and his emotional life is seen as a joke. So it's like the dad comes on and it's just like, you see inside his brain, it's just like, sports. And then the mom's like, what do you think? And he's like, I don't know. Yes, whatever you think, love. And then like you see a boy, she meets a boy at the hockey game, and he's like, oh girl, and it's like a joke, it's like boys are dumb. They're not complex. They're not, they don't have this emotional life. And I think we would never get away with that kind of stereotyping of girls, if it was like about, are girls like good at math, or are they good at, all the stereotypes that have been used against girls. If a mainstream Disney movie was to like stereotype a girl in that way, I think there'd be an outcry, but we just sort of accept it with boys with emotions.
And why do you think that is? Is that part of the sort of privilege, like the male privilege argument, like they've had it good for so long that, now it's girls' turn to have, like, again, it's more punitive. It's more punitive than like, nurturing. Yeah. So
I think it's a bit of both, because I think it's like they still have all the old rules of masculinity. So it's all of the like, man up, be tough, be strong, having too much of an emotional life is like feminine or emasculating in some way. So there's still all that old stuff. And now there's this kind of new narrative, which is like, you're so privileged, be quiet, don't, And so like if we mock boys, it's seen as like punching up rather than punching down. So that's kind of acceptable. It's acceptable to like punch up with a joke and be like, to mock someone who we perceive as having power. But I think for most boys, they don't see themselves, these are kids. They don't see themselves as having power and privilege, and maybe it shows up in certain ways, like when they're older, but it's not very apparent to them, at age 9 or 6 or 12 or whatever. It's like, what is all this privilege that everyone's talking about? Why should I be quiet?
Yeah, that's a hard one for kids. It's so interesting you bring out Inside Out too. I've been actually just wrote my Substack about anxiety, because there's a character in it. Not to give anything away, but there is an new feeling of anxiety, right? But when I think about the all the characters, there really is not one like positive male character in that entire movie. Like the only character that's kind of cool in any way is Anger, who's in the first movie, and he's like a bully, he's just funny.
Right,
He's just
right.
like
And
a
he's,
brute.
yeah. And
Yeah.
that's like something that a lot of boys were telling me in my interviews, that they were saying the only emotions that they're really allowed fully are happiness and anger. They're not really allowed full access to the other ones. So like anger
Yeah.
is like, you can be angry, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's the male thing. So they teach
But joy is a girl, and all the good emotions are the
boys.
girls.
Right. It's so true.
It's
and
crazy.
that's like really true in real life, that we allow boys anger. We don't allow them anything else. So we teach them to code all their emotions as anger. And that starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think.
The other thing you bring up is the idea of, boys and friendships, and girl friendships are so different than the way boy friendships are. And this kind of leads to, a different type of adult, even into your adult life. And talk to me about the differences of friendships between boys and girls, and how it sometimes has an adverse effect on men.
Yeah, so I think this is part of this, like, not teaching relational skills, not teaching emotional vulnerability. I think male friendships tend to be much more action orientated, and they tend to be, about shared interests rather than like emotional connection. And a lot of boys feel like they can't really be emotionally open with their male friends. This was like, I interviewed all these boys, and this kept coming up in different ways over and over again. And when they wanted like an emotionally vulnerable or supportive connection, they kind of looked to girls to provide that. So they either look to like
That's
female
so interesting.
friends.
Yeah. I was thinking, where do guys, guys basically, they find their female friends. That's where they can get emotional.
Yeah, that's where they can get it. And they can't get it from each other. They felt embarrassed talking to their male friends about that stuff. So they would either find a girlfriend or a female friend. But I think like in the culture, and you're seeing this, or I'm certainly seeing a lot of it, which is like women are kind of fed up of providing that role. We're just like, we've sort of run out of like goodwill. We're like, okay, well, we want to just focus. We want to be cared for as well. We want men who are competent to do this work for themselves and for each other, as well as just expecting us to do it for them. So I think we're not teaching boys to do it for themselves. And what was really sad was that I expected the boys to be like, oh, well, this is just the way that boys are, and this is the way we like it. But that wasn't what they were saying at all. They were all saying that they actually really wanted closer and more supportive connections, and they just didn't know how to do it. They didn't have the skills. They didn't feel like they had permission socially to do it. And so they craved that emotional connection. And then I think we're seeing down the line in like adult men, this like loneliness epidemic where so many men feel disconnected. They feel lonely. As you say, the suicide rate for men is like nearly 4 times that of for women. And so I think there is this crisis which starts in boyhood. We're not teaching the boys to do this stuff. And then there's all these downstream effects to it.
And then you also talk about this sort of lack of masculine, well, I don't even know if it's masculine, but lack of good role models for men, like in culture and just in their, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like that is such a problem. And it's interesting, Jerry Seinfeld has been talking about that. I don't know if you've heard him he's getting quoted on this a lot, where he's kind of like, he feels like there's no good male role models anymore. Do you agree with that? I mean, he's sort of like, and then when somebody says, well, who was a good role model back in the day? And he's like, well, Frank Sinatra. And like, he kind of brings up Marlon Brando. And I'm like, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, he's more into the like traditional,
like masculinity.
Yeah. And so he's like, sorry, I'm just going to stick that on. Yeah. So he's, so I think his whole shtick is like, we need to get back to the old way and have more like masculine, real men, which is not really, that's kind of almost the opposite of what I'm saying. Because I think what we don't have is like these role models for boys and men to see themselves as like these fully relational human beings. So people who have emotions and interiority, so the inside out thing, like a fully integrated human that has complex emotions and that has to take care of other people. So like, one story that I quote in the book was just seeing this magazine that was like aimed at tween girls, and it had this like pink sparkly cover. I saw it in the bookstore with my sons, and they're like, oh, look away, we can't look at this pink thing. Even glancing in that direction will be like emasculating and terrible. But and in that magazine, there was this story, and it was this girl. She'd been invited to these 2 birthday parties, and they were scheduled for the same time. And she didn't want to disappoint either one of her friends. So she's like running secretly between the 2 parties, pretending to be a full guest at both, and being like, eat the cake there, then run over to the other house and eat the cake there, and then play the game. And it was this tale of like very extreme emotional labor. You know, I sort of related to it as a woman, as a mom. I was like, oh yeah, I can see myself doing that. But I just realized that there are no stories where that character would be a boy. You know, a boy who's like thinking so hard about what his friends want and need that he is like sacrificing himself, you know, for that to happen.
Yeah.
And,
For his friends.
you know, and just like really tracking other people's emotions. And I think we're doing boys a disservice that we're not giving those kinds of role models. And I think it's not so much about celebrities exactly. I think, you know, that can help, but it's more about seeing those people in the material that you interact with all the time, you know, that like in your stories, in your books, in your TV shows, you know, it's that whole thing, like if you can't see it, you can't be it. And
yeah,
we've done it.
I wonder, I mean,
yeah.
Have you identified any in culture now that are like?
There's a few. Yeah, there's a few. So like one book that I talk about a lot that my sons really enjoyed and I thought was great was the book Wonder. There's a movie of it as well.
Oh, yeah.
It's about a boy with a facial disfigurement. Yeah, but the way that book is written is that he has very full interiority. You see his emotional life. It's complex. It's real. He thinks about his mother. He thinks about his father. He thinks about his friends. It's like a real story of a real person, which is rare with boys. I think either you get the like battling adventurer, you know, or you get, you know, conquering hero type, or you get the kind of anti-hero, which is like, I don't know if your kid ever read like The Wimpy Kid or the
Diary of the Wimpy Kid, totally. And I know you talk about that a lot. And you talk about
and it's just this guy who hates everything. Like he's defined by like he hates school, he hates girls, he hates his parents, he hates his siblings. It's just like this sort of negativity that is
but there must be something. I mean, those books have sold millions, so there must be something that he's tapped into something that boys
I think he
identify with, right?
Yes, I think he has, and I think part of it is that boys want real stories about their real lives. You know, all of their stories about these sort of far-flung adventures and battles and things that it's not really what their lives are like. So they see this and they're like, "Oh yeah, this is real. Yeah. This is me." But it's also
real and it's silly, and boys are into slapstick stuff. Yeah. No. So so there are thankfully some role models for kids. So once they get, and your kids aren't there yet, and my kid is just getting there, but he's not just, hopefully he'll never get to this place, but this whole idea of the failure to launch, right?
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah.
You know, this has become like a huge issue in particularly like Gen Z. And I guess some millennials, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be, it's like, I'm a Gen Xer, so it doesn't seem to be like everything skipped us.
Yeah.
So, but this idea that like, you know, people living in their parents' basement and like playing video games all day.
Yeah.
Is that all a result of what we've been talking about? Just like this inability to kind of like, they haven't been nurtured enough. They don't have intimate relationships with their friends. Like, what's that all about?
It's a combination of things. So I think all of the trends that we've been talking about, absolutely, and the kind of pressures of masculinity. And then, you know, and I write in the book about how I think these kind of hero stories, it's almost like most things that you have to do to become an adult are not really very heroic. It's things like learning to do your laundry or, you know, studying for your social studies test or whatever. And those kinds of things. I think if you've been set up with this idea that you're supposed to be this glorious, conquering, special hero, then those things are quite hard to do. But then also, I think because the boys now are like living in the digital era. And so I think it's very easy for them to sort of access this, you know, so if real world stuff is kind of fraught and boring, and then suddenly you've got this like option to bypass it with like video games where you can be the conquering glorious hero that you're supposed to be, then you have that option. And I think, you know, and also because like real life socializing is quite fraught for boys, especially I think to do with sex and relationships. You know, I think they're in a really complicated moment in the post Me Too era. So I think then it's very fraught for them, the idea of forming relationships with women, especially. Yeah. And so, but now we have like all these options. There's all this porn, there's all these video games, there's Discord, there's all these ways to just kind of bypass all of that real life stuff and just avoid it. And I think that's what's happening. Boys are becoming very avoidant.
And sort of the most extreme example of this is the incels.
Yes.
And I thought this was a really interesting part of your book because you track some incels down
Yeah.
and really talk, like a lot of time we just hear like this sort of periphery, like we hear about the worst of the incels.
Yeah,
right? We're going
right.
to hear about the mass murderers and they're horrible people. But first of all, for our audience, so they don't even know what an incel is, maybe explain that. And then maybe talk about this one incel person that you talked to and like what you learned from this person.
Yeah, so the incel movement is incel stands for involuntary celibate. So there are these guys that they are not having sex. Basically, they can't get women, and they are extremely resentful and angry and depressed about this. And they sort of form this community online. And at its most extremes, there's this violent fringe where incels and people associated with this movement have been implicated in some really horrific acts of mass violence, school shootings, and other types of mass shootings. But like the vast majority of them are they're not violent. They're just these kind of lonely, depressed, sometimes angry, sometimes like more internally sort of suicidal or depressed guys who are on the internet, and they hang out in these spaces. And there's a lot of like, I went to incel message boards. I went to their kind of online spaces. There's some horrifying misogyny on there. There's horrifying like racism, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, like all of these disgusting, like toxic things are very real in those spaces. But also there's this sort of sense of real brotherhood among these guys as well, that they're very sort of tender and supportive to each other in a way like that men aren't really in real life. And that was a real surprise to me, you know. And I went very deep and interviewing like two guys in particular. I talked to a few others, but there's two that made it into the book. And you know, they were telling me some really interesting stuff. I think they felt so marginalized in real life. I think they felt, you know, and in some ways it was kind of, the incel communities were quite freeing to them. It's almost like they'd given up on any hope that they could ever achieve that male sort of masculinity standard, that kind of impossible masculinity of the hero, the square-jawed like guy who gets all of the girls and whatever. So almost because they'd given up, they sort of found that quite freeing, and they were free to be emotional and vulnerable. They were like, we're never going to achieve this, so we might as well just be all these things anyway, which was a real surprise to me. But also what was so sort of shocking and sad to me was just how these guys just felt so shut down. They felt like they just couldn't seek help. They felt there was nowhere for them to go. They felt like this one guy, he really wanted to get therapy. He was he couldn't afford it. That was a part of the problem. But also he felt like he was scared that if he went to therapy, they would just be like, well, you're male, you're so privileged, you know, shut up. We don't want to listen to you. So it was sort of being pushed further and further to the margins of society. And they were, you know, the incels just felt like, in a way, I sort of thought they'd be these kind of freaks almost, these just like fringe guys. But actually a lot of what they were saying was actually very similar to what kind of so-called regular guys were telling me. It was just a sort of more extreme example of a lot of the trends that we were seeing with
it just seems like there is an innate human want to be part of something, part of a group, part of a tribe, right?
Yes.
And I feel like in that some of those things maybe in the kind of overcorrection of you know, letting women thrive and all this stuff, some of that stuff has been pushed away or made like less in reach of a lot of guys. Like, you know, I'm not saying there should be like boys club. Maybe I am saying that. Maybe there, you know, maybe there should be clubs. And
no, I think there should be clubs because, you know, so Christopher Pepper, who is a guy who works with boys here in the Bay Area, he has a great stack called I think it's Mr. Health Teacher. Anyway, but he runs boys clubs here in San Francisco within schools. And he says that he's got all this great data on how having these all male spaces where boys can share all this stuff and be connected is actually really helpful for them, and is doing, you know, he's doing great work. And I think that actually we need this, you know, we need to give boys permission to do this and ways to find connection. We urgently need boys to be able to be more connected.
Yeah, because if you don't have access to that, like my son is very lucky. He's in a band, right? So there's that kind of like that option. Although there's all the, you know, he's in a band too, so there's all the what comes with that, right? The bandmates fighting, but he's part of something. Like and I remember when we sent him away to camp, to this like music camp in Michigan, he came back and he was just like, he went for 3 weeks and he just was like, oh my God, I didn't know these people existed in the world. Like there's people that have all the same interests as me. And like, it was kind of an incredible moment. And I even find myself as an adult, like I'm always looking for groups to join, like, how can I be involved? And actually my therapist, I'll give her a shout out, Kimberly Resnick out here. She said, hey, I have a men's group that meets on Monday. It's just some of my clients. I kind of curate who's going to be in the room, but there's like 8 of you and I'll be in the room, but you just can talk about stuff. And it's like been incredible for me to just have a group of men who are like, there's no agenda. Like we're not friends outside of the room. Yeah. I mean, some of us have become sort of friendly, but like, like we can just say whatever we want to say.
I think it's so important. And I think that men, women for lots of reasons, I think find it easy to find intimacy and to find community. And I think, and I see it with like moms and versus dads, the moms just gravitate towards, mom's night out and mom's sharing and mom's groups and, and the dads are really on the periphery of this. And I think these all male spaces are so important. And I think, absolutely, it's wonderful that we've devoted so many resources to helping girls and women. And I appreciate that. But, this system like harms boys and men too. We're not on opposite sides.
Do you think exactly. Do you think you would have seen this as clearly if you weren't a mom?
Absolutely not. I sort of worry that I'm like one of those Republican senators who's like, as a father of daughters, suddenly, know that thing where it's like men just don't realize that women are people until they have daughters. I think that maybe that I've had a bit of that in reverse, that, that this stuff was just totally invisible to me. I thought, men have everything. They're so lucky. They get,
all the privilege,
all the pay, the patriarchy. And all of those things are true as well. It's not that they're not true, but what I was not at all aware of like the harms and what they're missing out on. And I see, the way that things are for my sons. And sometimes I think like, this is a half life, this is like half all of the stuff that was so easy for me to access as a girl and a woman in terms of intimacy, connection, emotionality is really hard for them.
Yeah. And, as we have this conversation, I'd always kind of in the side of my brain, I hear somebody saying, oh, world's smallest violin for all the boys out there. It's like, but and I get that obviously, as well. And I'm sure I was wondering, like, since your book has come out, have you had some pushback from like
a little bit? So, it's interesting. I expected more of that. So when, and maybe it's to come, it's only been in the world for like 2 weeks, but, But so mostly I've had like really positive response from women and from men, actually. I wasn't expecting to get so many men reading this book. It's called BoyMom. And I thought that when we gave it that title, it was like cutting off a male audience. But actually I've had a really positive response from men. I had one experience, and mainly women have been really positive and said, oh yeah, this has opened my eyes to this. And especially most of my readership is probably women who have a connection, either have sons or Right. But I did, so I did an interview for Anne Helen Peterson's Substack, which is wonderful, culture study, on the weekend. And I did get a few comments of like, you're both sidesism, that you're centering men at the expense of women. They've had so much privilege. And I was like, well, look, yes, I acknowledge that men do have a lot of privilege, but privilege and harm sort of intertwine in these very complex ways. And I think that, the same system, the patriarchy that harms women and girls also harms men and boys. And, we just have to see this as complex, that these two things can coexist. Yeah.
There's, you always know when somebody comes at you with such a hard opinion in one way that they're not seeing the other side. Like, it's just, this is a complicated issue.
Yeah. And it's sort of a shame that like both sidesism has become a word that means like bad faith, really, rather than like that we should look at both sides of something,
Yeah, it's been twisted because that word, I mean, it was used originally for a completely different. That was like, both sidesism was like when the New York Times was trying to tell, the right story as legitimate as the left or whatever. That was always how they used. You're both sides.
Climate change or like
we have to give the other side.
We have to give the other side, and that's true. And I think that we apply this to patriarchy, but actually, I think there's very real both sides to this, and it's not even both sides. They're not in opposition to each other. We're on the same side. The system that's harming girls and women is also harming boys and men. And
and you said yes, we should smash the patriarchy, but let's not be punitive about it. I think you say that in your book.
But also it's like, let's smash the patriarchy for the benefit of men as well. You know, it's not like the patriarchy is something that's working so well for men that it's, you know.
Right. What did you think of Barbie? Did you feel like it had a good message? Because I felt like boys walking out of that movie might be like, wait, am I a bad guy?
Yeah.
Like, you know, that was another one of those movies where all the men are idiots.
Yeah,
you know?
and that was the thing. I wish that we could. So, like, part of me was like thrilled that Barbie, you know, and Barbie was like a big trope in my life. I grew up with a second wave feminist mom. I wasn't allowed a Barbie. My grandma eventually bought me one secretly, and, you know, well, not secretly, but she gave it to me. But, you know, so Barbie, the fact that Barbie is taking on the cause of feminism, I think is wonderful. And that shows that there's huge progress. But absolutely, it was like Ken was this vacant idiot. And we weren't, you know, so I think my son's watching that. It's like awkward for them because it's not just like you're bad. It's like also you're idiotic, you're stupid. And they're not stupid. They're complex. And these things affect them as well. And, you know, and it's like, is there a way that we can tell that story in a more interesting and complex way? You know, I thought half of it was interesting, but I'd love to see the other half. You know, I would have loved for that to go into like why the system isn't working so well for Ken either.
I have to. Who's the filmmaker again of that film?
Greta Gerwig.
Greta Gerwig, and I wonder if she has boys. I just wonder.
Actually, I don't know. Actually, I have no idea. But
I wonder if she would write that movie if she had boys. And again, it's such a hard issue because I don't want to fall on the far right of this either. Like I don't feel like, oh, you know, boys are being emasculated, and it's like
and there's this
feminization of America. Like I don't really believe that either. I'm in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think also that like what's really sad about this is that it's sort of become this right-wing coded thing. Like to care about boys and men, suddenly it's like a dog whistle for like being this like right-wing men's rights activist. And it really shouldn't be. It should be a cause of the left. You know, it should be a progressive cause to care about boys and men as well.
So let's talk about, as we close here, and we're not going to change the world in this phone call, but you do have some ideas, at least of ways that we can move forward in a positive way. And one thing that you say is name boys sexism. Like talk to me a little bit about like when you see boy sex, like we know about sexism, right? Yeah. And as for on the other side, we all know, we can see it. Yeah. We know what a misogynistic person looks like.
Absolutely. And we can see the subtle. Yeah. So we can see the big sexism for girls, and we can see the little things too. I think like most like 5th grade girls can be like, that's sexist. Don't stereotype me like this. And I think, you know, with boys, I don't even know if sexism is the right word, but we need a vocabulary to describe this. So like the inside out thing is an example of this phenomenon. It's like, why are we allowing this to pass, that it's really fine to be like, boys are dumb, they don't have a complex emotional life? Why are we allowed to stereotype boys in that way? And like, why are we not calling it out? And like calling it out feels like this kind of men's rights activist sort of project. But actually, you know, so all the ways that boys are like stereotyped, all the ways that they're kind of boxed in and they're not allowed access to the full range of emotions and thought and complexity that girls are, you know, all the ways that we tell them to like man up and, you know, give them all these harmful messages. So if we just had a vocabulary to like talk about that and to name it and to see that as a reasonable cause, you know, a reasonable progressive cause. So that's part of it. And just to sort of like call it out when we see it and give boys a vocabulary to talk about that, you know.
Sort of, yeah. I love how you talk about the difference between buddy, like when we, like there's so many people call their son buddy and sweetheart. Yeah. And it's true, like, especially when your kids are, I did not call my kids buddy, but I mean, I can't, every day I see some dad chasing after his son saying, hey buddy, come this way, buddy. Yeah. Come on, buddy, bud. Yeah. And I don't know, it always drove me crazy. I hate it, but you explain like why it kind of like bothers you. And
so the first time I really noticed it was like when my youngest son, so he's 5 years old, it's his first day of kindergarten, and he's going through the gate, and there's this like guy, I think he's like a volunteer from the school, this big guy who's like adult man who's greeting them all. And so there's like 2 girls in front of him in the line, and the guy's like, hi sweetheart, and then the next one, you know, hi sweetheart, and then my son comes in and his voice like drops a whole octave. He's like, hi buddy, and like high fives him. And it's like, it's so sweet and well meaning. It's not like this guy's doing anything like horrible, but it's like, you know, he sees those girls as 5 years old and in need of nurture and protection on their first day of kindergarten. They're scared, they're anxious. And my son is equally, you know, anxious and emotional and worried about leaving his mom and all the things that every 5-year-old is. But suddenly he's been like tracked into this like buddy thing where he's like backslapping and come get a beer with me and like, you know,
Yeah.
and it's something, you know, on the face of it, it's such a minor example. It's like, you know, who cares? But then all of these things add up. They're just these little incremental things. And I think we're getting good at like calling out like the way that like sweetheart can be like patronizing when it's used for girls, or it can be like diminishing. But like, we're not looking at the other side of it. We're not looking at like, what's it like to be a boy and to not feel that kind of nurture. And you see that sort of examples of that in a million different ways, you know, of like how we project this kind of masculinity onto boys as like little man, you know, like with a 1-day-old baby and, you know, buddy and like, it's just, we talk to them in a different way. We think they need different things and they don't. They need the same level of nurture and care and intimacy and connection as any human.
You also talk about carving out like a face-to-face rule, like so that kids, like making a time for boys to actually have like real FaceTime, not a face-to-face time.
Right.
with boys.
They stole that from us.
Right, FaceTime. I know. Even they took that from us. It is. That's so subtle that they did it. I just realized that.
I know. Me too.
It's horrible.
Actually, that's
they
terrible.
co-opted the language.
Co-opted. Yeah. So this is the thing. Like with the screen time thing, I think. Look, I feel as though like the last thing that any American parent needs in this moment is like more guilt piled on about screen time. And there are reasons why we give our kids screen time, because I think we don't have a good social safety net. We don't have like real childcare. So we need to use screens, especially during the pandemic. But I think it's about making sure that we prioritize like face-to-face connection as well. So it's not like getting rid of the screens, but like just really noting that. And there's so much data that shows that boys are like migrating to screens more. It's this phenomenon called displacement, where it's like you replace real life socializing with screen-based socializing. And that is much more of a problem for boys at the moment than it is for girls. So I think if we can like note that, be aware of it, and then really try to prioritize in-person time for boys. And it's hard, you know, like but kids come over here and they just want to be on screens all the time. And, you know, involves some saying no. And then it's like this painful moments where they have no idea what to do with themselves apart from be on a screen. Maybe this is just my kids, but I've heard the same from many families. And it's just like pushing through that discomfort and being like, yes, you can do it. You know, I believe in you. I believe that you can find something to do that's not this. And then they do. They eventually do. It's excruciating, but they do.
How did you come up with it? You must come up with a lot of book ideas, right? I mean, you're like, how is this the one that you were like, okay, I'm going to devote the next 2 years or whatever it took you to 3 years of my life to writing? Like, what was this?
Yeah, I think this one just felt so urgent to me because it was like a combination of having 3 sons and this like cultural conversation about toxic masculinity, both happening at the same time. It was just so much on my mind. It was from a real place of fear and pain, you know, and I think that kind of writing is the best kind of writing. Like my first book was a subject that really interested me, but it wasn't coming from this pace of like desperation in me.
Yeah,
you know?
Like this is real and that's what the book it really is. It's like a plea. Yeah. You're like so worried about becoming a person you don't want to be and that your kids are not going to turn out right.
Yeah, and it's coming from a very real, very raw, very authentic place. And I always believe like in all kinds of writing, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, whatever, that is like a good starting point, you know, for it to feel urgent to write, and that it's coming from something very raw and very real that you're exploring in the writing. And I think that's what this was for me.
Are you already thinking about your next book? Like what's raw emotion now?
Well, actually, I'm actually trying.
I mean, you're in the thick of parenting.
I'm in the thick of parenting and I'm in the thick of book launch. So, but I'm working very tentatively on a fiction project, a novel, which explores some of the same themes, but in fiction. And I think sometimes, you know, it's a different way of approaching it because it's not I think as my kids grow older, I don't want to write so much about them. You know, they have their privacy. It's like their life. Yeah. But, you know, to be able to explore some of the things in fiction, I think is freeing in a way.
I'm right there with you. It is. Fiction is kind of what I've been thinking about writing.
Oh, I'm excited to read yours.
Yeah. Me too. This has been such a joy, Ruth. Thank you so much.
No, it's been such a pleasure.
And if people want to know more about you and your book, do they go to your website?
Yeah, so this is the book, BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. My website is ruthwhipman.com, 2 P's in the middle. And I write a Substack, which is called I Blame Society, where I explore...
I just subscribed today.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so I explore all these themes about gender and masculinity and boyhood, and also write about other things too. So... I hope you'll sign up.
Maybe you need a podcast.
Podcast would be good. Yeah. That's
cool,
another
right?
whole thing. Yeah.
I know that's a whole
thing.
I can talk to you if you want to podcast. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining.